You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And welcome back, everyone else, to episode 6 of Common Descent.
Yes, our last episode seems to have gone over really well with the listening populace. And it also seems like people really liked our little mini episode that we did.
Which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was a cool, just to ramble for 20 minutes about something cool.
Just kind of dive into it.
Yeah.
So today's topic, and we're going back to overviewing something big, is on the evolution of flight, which is a really exciting subject, a really, really diverse group of things we could talk about with this.
Yes.
And heavily studied. So we could go into detail on just about every aspect of this subject at length. There's a whole lot we could talk about here.
We often say that the topics that we're talking about could be their own entire podcast. This subject could be at least 4 entire podcasts.
Yes. Yes, it could have 4 separate podcasts, and you'll see why.
Yes, it could. And that's just one group of flying animals.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this episode is going to be a bit of a flyby, if you will.
One of us had to say it.
And it was me.
This one will indeed have to be a bit of a whirlwind overview. We'll just kind of cover all the hot spots and highlights as we go over just all about flight, who flies, how do they fly, and how did they learn to fly, or how did they get to be flying? Because it's a slightly different answer or lack of answer for each of those.
Yeah.
Depending on which animal you're talking about.
Really cool topic.
But, of course, as usual, before we start that, it's time for the news.
Time for the news. What's news?
I'm going to let you start off this news segment because I want to end on one of mine since it flows very nicely into our subject.
My first article, and you'll notice that our news today is extraordinarily dinosaur heavy, which is okay.
It is.
But the first one that I have is not about dinosaur skeletons, but instead about footprints.
Footsies.
So this is actually not news, or at least the site itself is not news, but a big survey just came out in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology about a region famous for dinosaur fossils in Western Australia.
Which is rare.
Yes, it is. Dinosaur footprints, extremely rare, footprints in general. Mm-hmm. So to have a region that's famous for them, and this is one of the best footprint assemblages anywhere in the world. This is a section of coastline. It's many, many kilometers, dates back to the early Cretaceous, so 130, 140 million years ago. This particular study concerned a 25-kilometer section of the coastline. For the last 5 or 6 years, a group of researchers from Queensland University and James Cook University, both in Australia, surveyed almost 50 different track sites and identified thousands of different tracks, of which about 150 of them were identifiable as distinct types of trackways. And there are at least 11 and as many as 21 different types of footprints representing different types of footprint makers. All dinosaurs.
Very cool.
Of those footprints, there are meat-eating dinosaurs, duckbill-type dinosaurs, the long-necked sauropods. There are even armored dinosaurs like stegosaurs, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
And some of them are, a handful of these, at least about a half dozen of them, are new. So, interesting thing that happens with footprints, which are called ichnofossils, right? Trace fossils.
Mm-hmm.
It is almost completely impossible to assign a footprint to a skeleton.
Yes.
So, you wouldn't ever really be able to say, hey, this is a T-Rex footprint. Because it's really hard to say that. So every type of footprint gets its own species name. Call them ichnospecies. In this particular survey, they identified at least 6 new species, ichnospecies. At least one of them is a really big sauropod, whose footprints are almost as wide across as Will or myself are long.
Jesus.
And there's a particularly large footprint that looks like it's a really big stegosaur as well. And one of the really cool things about this is that early Cretaceous fossils of this age are not really known well from this region, and this gives insights into the ecosystems of that time and includes some dinosaurs, like the stegosaurs, that weren't expected to be found in the early Cretaceous. That these were holdovers from the late Jurassic, which is pretty cool, and that's information that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
It's cool that being able to use trace fossils like this, much like when you're on a hiking trail and you see footprints of some animal that you're never going to see because it can hear you coming a mile away.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool how these can complete a picture. As you said, we're not going to really be able to match up dinosaur to footprint because this is an impression left by soft tissue mostly, the pad of the foot, which, if you've ever looked at an elephant skeleton, can be completely different from inside to outside of what the bottom of the foot looks like. So these don't tell us exactly, but we can at least get them within the right group, and they can start telling you, did these travel as a group? Did they, travel in this area? When did they live? It's a really cool, just another, not just so much piece of the puzzle, but kind of a puzzle, more to the puzzle from another angle, which is very cool.
Yeah. One last cool note about these footprints is that apparently indigenous people in the region have incorporated these footprints into their oral history.
Yeah.
Specifically myths about a being, I don't know if it's a person necessarily or like a creator, I think, who is called the Emu Man because he leaves behind three-toed footprints.
Yep.
Which we know today are the footprints of theropod dinosaurs.
Which makes Australia even cooler.
Yes, they have a dinosaur in their creation myth.
It's fantastic. All right, cool. So on the note of awesome dinosaur stuff and on the note of theropods, my first news article is one that has exploded a bit in recent science news, not as much as our last news article on We Digress, but this one is about a new species of tyrannosaur that was discovered recently, and it's called Daspletosaurus horneri. Now, I say tyrannosaur, this is in the group of Tyrannosaurus, but you'll often see articles saying Tyrannosaurus this, Tyrannosaur, or, being very vague and, once again, alluding to the more famous cousin. Yes. This is a separate species. Tyrannosaurs were actually a fairly diverse group.
Yeah.
This was found in Montana and came from late Cretaceous. It's about 75.2 to 74.4 million years ago that this would have been around. And just kind of painting the picture, it was about 30 feet long, just shy of it, and just over 7 feet tall. So big enough, but not one of the crazy big ones. And it also had a broad snout and horns behind the eyes. Now, its name, Horneri, does not have to do with those horns. It's actually named after Jack Horner.
Yes. Very famous paleontologist.
Indeed.
Yep.
Worked on Jurassic Park, all that good stuff.
Yeah. Famous before that, though.
Yeah, that's true.
And even more famous after it.
Yes. So, lots of cool stuff with this one. This is this is a very meaty article. There's a lot we could go into. New species in and of itself is exciting. So far as they can tell, it's the youngest and last of its lineage of the Daspletosaurs.
Yeah.
Its closest relative would be Daspletosaurus tauros, which was found in Alberta, Canada. The cool thing about that is that, from what they can tell with the close location and evolutionary relationship, it suggests that the tauros basically just morphed and evolved into horneri, is what the writers of the paper, their observations are telling them, which would be anagenesis, which is a form of evolution where instead of branching, one species just changes into another with a single line. It's, I know, a form of evolution that is debated by some. It is not always as supported, but there has been some support for it. And if this turns out to be true, it would be yet another bit of support for it.
Yeah.
So whether that is what's happening or not, it's interesting. It's cool.
Yeah.
The skull was really well preserved, and they had an adult and a juvenile, and I think a subadult as well. And so they got some really good details in the skulls. And this is where a lot of the articles are coming in, is that they started to get a lot of observations in what the face of this tyrannosaur was like, which could give us information of what other tyrannosaurs would have been like, including the famous one.
Yeah.
And from what they can tell, the texture of the skull is very similar to that of the skull of a crocodilian, in that it's rough, what we call rugose,
Mm-hmm.
all the way down to the tooth row before it gets very smooth, which means that they most likely had a very crocodilian face with those tight to the face scales that went almost to the teeth. And the reason this is important is some of you may or may not have heard it or saw it when it came up a little while back, where there was the questioning and debate of whether or not Tyrannosaurus had lips.
Yes.
And the question was basically asked because dentine on most animals wears out if exposed to the air, if it's not able to stay damp.
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying if that was the case with Tyrannosaurus teeth, they should have lips, much like a monitor lizard, or the way the velociraptors are pictured in the Jurassic Park movies. You know, that
with the teeth covered by the sort of fleshy, it's not like pouty lips, but just
yes,
that the teeth aren't
they
exposed.
had big, full lips. And
yes.
no, it caused a great stir. Anytime you talk about changing anything about T-Rex, you're going to get a lot of people up in arms. But it's really not that crazy of an idea. You know, we've already pictured it. There's many reptiles today that have it. This is saying that most likely not. Most likely no lips. It most likely had a very crocodilian face because according to the texture of the bone, if it is working like a crocodilian, there's no room for lips. The scales went right down to the teeth, just like on a croc. So that's one evidence against our smiling lippy T-Rex.
And I've already seen a bunch of people online, other researchers, basically saying that that's not a valid interpretation. So this is, once again, not the nail in the coffin. Just
exactly.
So
this is a big article partially because they made a lot of observations and either suggestions or drew conclusions that are going to end up being very divisive or just raise a whole lot of discussion.
Yeah.
So that's the first part. The next part that was very interesting is they saw that along the skull, especially along the lower jaw, snout and area, there's lots of very small holes, which would be, for most likely, nerve endings, once again, very much like a crocodilian.
Yeah.
If you look at a crocodilian skull right around the lips and coming up the snout a little bit, there are just hundreds of little small holes that are for little nerve ending pits that are pressure sensors that the crocodilians use to sense motion in the water. If that is what these are in this tyrannosaur skull, it meant they also had a very sensitive snout, much like a crocodilian. This would be known as the trigeminal nerve, which in lots of animals is used for things like the whiskers on cats, the electroreception in things like platypus, and evidently the whisker pits of dolphins. I did not know that was a thing that was discovered recently until I was reading about this, which is very cool. Infrared sensing in pit vipers. This nerve has been adapted to many, as the paper quoted, sixth senses in other animals, where it's those extra sensory, that whether it's texture or actually some sense we do not possess. If they had this sensitive nose, it raised the question of what they were using it for, and they said a couple of very obvious ones like object manipulation. If you have tiny arms, you're using your mouth and snout to move things around, so you need to have a very sensitive, dexterous snout and mouth. They suggested that maybe female tyrannosaurs could have used it to test the temperature of their nests.
Yeah, like crocs do.
The part that you've probably heard about is the suggestion that maybe with sensitive snouts, they were using it during courtship, pre-courtship, pre-mating, basically foreplay, or courtship displays to rub their snouts against each other as a way to bond or as a way to communicate.
Tyrannosaur kisses.
Yes. It's those little, it's like those little stuffed animals with the magnets in their nose.
Yes, exactly.
But Tyrannosaurs. And so it's raised lots of titles like Tyrannosaurs Show Their Sensitive Side, and people hearing about, hey, I just heard Tyrannosaurs nuzzle each other. Is this true? I've been asked that exact question by one of my friends. And so
that It's funny that so many things went and ran with that idea because that is literally one sentence in the
It's
paper.
one sentence, and it's like the last sentence of the paper where they're like, and
Yep.
maybe this. All right, well, thank you for reading.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting paper, and if anything, we now are gonna, I'm sure, have lots of paleo art of Eskimo kissing tyrannosaurs.
My favorite thing that this sort of brought to mind with they were talking about what they use the sensitive snouts for in modern animals that have a
Mm-hmm.
similar structure, and they pointed out that crocodilians that sort of sensitivity is what allows them to use their jaws, which are otherwise supremely powerful, for really delicate tasks like moving
Yes.
their eggs and moving their young, which is really interesting because it brings to mind a big tyrannosaur, snuffling around into its nest to sort of roll its eggs around or picking up its young to move them from place to place, which is a really interesting, this notion that in much the same way as a crocodilian, those jaws may have not only been for snapping dinosaur bones, but also for really delicate and
Yeah.
dexterous activities, which is so cool.
They said that with the number of the holes and everything, if they're interpreting it correctly, it would give them roughly the sensitivity similar to a human fingertip along the
Yes.
snout. So this is the same nerve that allows elephants to pick up pennies with their trunk.
Yep.
So yeah, it could be doing really cool stuff.
Yeah. We should mention that this is a paper that published in Scientific Reports by Thomas
Yes.
Carr and a bunch of other people.
Yes, indeed.
All right. So you said that your second news piece ties nicely into today's topic. So my second news piece ties nicely into last time's topic.
Working backwards.
Yeah. So episode 5 was all about the KPG extinction, meteorite impact, and other things. One of the coolest things that has happened recently, which is to say in the last year, a team of scientists in summer, May, June of 2016, traveled to the Yucatan Peninsula to drill into the Chicxulub crater, which is the crater left behind by the asteroid at the end of the Cretaceous period. And there's been all sorts of interesting findings and papers that have been coming out about this, but in the last couple of weeks, one particular new finding that came out, which was discussed at a conference recently, done by some folks at the Lunar and Planetary Institute. They examined the geologic evidence from drilling down through the layers above and below the actual crater and found evidence that the impact of the asteroid created cracks and fissures that would have filled up with superheated water that may have served as the homes for the first organisms to recolonize the crater site.
Oh.
So this is the idea that the renovation that this asteroid did at the bottom of this shallow seafloor left this hydrothermal system that once the waters started to cool down might have been home to a bunch of the kind of microorganisms that you see at volcanic hot springs and places like that today. And that this system, based on the stratigraphy, it looks like this hydrothermal system probably lasted at least a few 100,000 years. And these may have been sort of the first colonizers of the actual site after the impact, may have filled in this heated water system.
Cool.
The reason that one of the reasons that this was being discussed by people from the Lunar and Planetary Institute is because this also has implications for the earliest life on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
One of the prevailing ideas for where the first life on Earth may have originated is in hydrothermal vents and similar systems like that. And so this sort of raises some interesting questions about what the relationship may have been between asteroid impacts, which were a lot more common in the early days of the Earth, what kind of areas they may have left behind, and how that sort of changed topography may have provided areas for early life to colonize. So It starts off with just some really interesting observations, but there are some really neat implications, perhaps, for this study as well.
I really like this one because the idea of life being started by asteroid impact, the impact of distant asteroids and meteors in Earth's early years has been an idea before, typically from the idea that it was brought to Earth somehow from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Though not a supported or typically definitive one. That's more just a cool idea.
Yeah.
This is a much cooler version to me where it was able to kickstart the right situation.
Yeah. It created the right habitat.
Yeah.
Which is
so
an
instead
interesting
of having
link.
Evolution, the movie for everyone, it's instead of having that situation,
yeah,
it's much more realistic. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So, last news article, and this one flows very nicely into our subject today.
We're super professional.
Yes, it's like we planned it. We asked them to hold off announcing this research.
Don't publish yet.
It's like, well, wait, what's it about? Could you wait until episode 6?
They were going to publish around episode 4. It wouldn't have made any sense at all.
It's just unprofessional. This is about a new, one of the most well-preserved bird fossils to date. Many calling it the most well-preserved. So, I mean, this is a ridiculously well-preserved, from everything bone to soft tissues and feathers, all have been preserved to some degree with this fossil. It is a Chinese fossil called Eo Confucius ornis, which is a weird name, from the Confucius ornis forms. Confucia ornithorms, there you go. It's long mouthful names. But these are some of the early birds, and they're famed for the occurrence of the beak in the bird family tree.
Okay.
So this is where you first see that. But these are some of the really primitive members, and this was one of the most primitive and earliest member of this group.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was published in National Science Review, and this fossil is from the early Cretaceous, 130 to 120 million years ago, and found in China in the Heujing, I'm probably butchering that, formation. That's about a 130 million year old fossil deposit. And it's the second of these birds, this specimen to be found, even though there are many other specimens of their group. But of this particular species, it is only the second. And it reveals a whole bunch of cool things. First off, just a well-preserved fossil is always cool. But the soft tissues and feathers it preserves reveal a couple of cool things. One of the soft tissues preserved in this fossil are called patagia, or patagiums, which are, we mentioned this back when we were talking about, I can't remember which dinosaur it came up in.
Oh, this was, we may have brought it up because it was found in non-flying dinosaurs.
Exactly.
They had patagia on the hind legs. But it's very common in flying animals.
It's very, very common. In fact, we are going to go through a whole bunch of patagium vocabulary. I hope everyone's taking notes, because all of our flying animals just about have a patagia somewhere. Now, patagium are the folds of skin, usually between joints. So this is the flap of skin like between the shoulder and the wrist that covers that inner elbow region. Mm-hmm. From the bottom of the arm to the waist on many flying animals.
Yeah, if you imagine a bat or a pterosaur,
yes.
like the membranes, those are called patagia.
And birds have them as well, you just can't see them because of the feathers. But if you ever eat chicken wings, you'll see it.
Mm-hmm.
When you eat a wing, you'll see that between the elbow there is a flap of skin covering that joint that is all stretchy.
Yeah.
And this is part of what helps form the aerodynamic airfoils that allow birds to fly. And so not only did it preserve these patagiums, but it revealed which ones they had. So there are 3 main patagiums on the bird wing that are most important. The pro-patagium, which is the one in front of the arm that I mentioned. The post-patagium, which is from the back of the hand to the ulna, so from the back of the hand down toward that elbow.
Mm-hmm.
And then the allure patagium, which is the flap of skin that just goes from the first digit, aka the thumb, to the back of the hand, which is a little one. But
interesting.
They lacked that one.
Huh.
So Eo Confucius ornis did not have that extra little one. So that was something that came along later in the bird line. Even cooler than the fact that these preserved, the tissue structures of the patagiums were preserved well enough for them to see the internal structure to a degree. And the internal structure of patagiums is made up of a network of collagen and fibers that give it a form that helps form those aerodynamic shapes, meaning that it could likely fly. It was a powered flyer. So lots of cool stuff about how did bird wings form and in what order everything evolved. The feathers also reveal that there was most likely sexual dimorphism among these birds, which is the first time it's been able to be like really confirmed and observed.
Yeah. And that sexual dimorphism ties into what I think is the coolest thing about this specimen.
Yeah, it's a big deal. So the reason that they are able to know that they have sexual dimorphism is that they know that their specimen, this one that is being described, is a female because the ovaries that were preserved, let that sink in for a moment,
yes,
had developing yolks in it, which is just awesome. So first, this tells us that, one, it's a female. Two, they developed very similar to modern birds. Their eggs, which is in a very rapid pace, while many other reptiles and close relative archosaurs like crocodilians develop them slower, and even later bird lineages developed slower egg-laying processes from what we can see.
Interesting.
So the Confucius ornithorns had a very modern egg development process.
Interesting. The point about finding ovary tissue, which, for starters, is, finding any soft tissue remnants is always really cool, and it happens rarely, but it does happen. Ovaries are a really, really fantastic thing to find.
Yeah.
But it also, I don't know how many people realize this because of the way we colloquially speak about fossils. When it comes to vertebrate fossils and dinosaurs especially, it is almost impossible to know the sex of an extinct individual. Like, we talk about dinosaurs, oh, she does this and he does this, but 99 times out of 100, way more than that actually, we do not know. One of the only good guaranteed ways that we have determined to understand the sex of an extinct animal is to find the actual sex organs.
Yes.
And this one has it. And then, like you said, the feather patterning or the feather arrangement was different.
Yeah.
Based on what we know from some other specimens, which does indicate that the feathers may have been different in males and females.
Yeah, so it looked like, once again, very much like many modern birds, that the females lacked the longer tail feathers and were smaller than the males. So the males were a bit bigger and probably had longer tail feathers, which a lot of birds today have, mostly for like display and stuff. So very similar there. And then the feathers are preserved well enough that we know a little bit about how they looked, which for this female was a black spotted wings, gray body, and a red throat patch.
Interesting.
Which, once again, I can't describe how cool it is to me that we are not now just saying, because when we were kids, dinosaurs were basically brown when they were drawn. And then people started going, well, hey, why can't they have stripes? Why can't they have spots? And they started adding those in. Now we're able to say, all right, draw it with a red throat patch. No, because we found it.
Yeah, the one on this fossil.
Yes, on this specific one, we know it was about this size, no, lower. That's fantastic to me.
Yeah, that's a whole episode.
Oh, yeah. So this one had a lot of stuff to it. I could only find it on like 2 different news sites, so hopefully this one will blow up a little bit later on, because it's a very cool article. That is my last news article, and that closes up our news section.
Yes, on to the topic.
Go on to our very different subject of how did things fly?
Yeah. Hey, man, what a segue. Moving right on in.
So this one, we'll go ahead and jump into it. We're going to try to overview flight as an evolutionary pattern, device, anomaly, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Flight is a very cool thing, and it's significant for a few reasons. And so the reason it's getting a whole episode is because flight is important. One, it really changes the way an animal can function in its environment.
Yeah.
Flight is kind of like the cheat code when it comes to nature.
Flight is always one of those. I have long maintained that flight, in my opinion, is the most ridiculous thing nature ever came up with.
Yeah.
And the way that I like the thought experiment that I use to get that across is, imagine if you had never heard of anything that flew, and someone told you that they came from a faraway land where there were animals that could jump up really high into the sky, not come down, and just move around up there.
Yeah.
It's insane that is something that evolved.
It's like the book Flat World, where
Yeah.
if you're a dot living in a 2D world and someone goes, "Well, have you ever heard of a sphere?" You're going to go, "You're a crazy person."
Yeah.
It's the same concept of every other animal minus like things that can climb trees, which is adding maybe a couple 100 feet to your to your dimension. But everything else moves in just an XY grid pattern on the ground.
Yeah.
Flying has added a Z, which is super normal if you live underwater. But for all terrestrial animals, this is a huge, literally, jump up.
Yes.
So,
much like Superman, flying animals can leap tall buildings in a single bound and also not land.
And then just keep flying because they have wings. So, how does it help animals is one of the things, and we'll talk about why it's good and then why all animals don't fly, because that's kind of the logical question after is, so why isn't everything flying?
Yep.
So, some of the big advantages is, one, you can get away from stuff. You can now get off the ground where most predators are and either live up high, nest up high, hide up high. There's plenty of ground foraging birds that still fly because when you hear that noise, running is good. Going away from the noise and the ground in general is better.
Yes.
So flying really just gives you a way out that no other animals have. It also gives you access to things that are out of reach from everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
There are birds that, for instance, nest on islands that are effectively lifeless. They are desolate. No real life has made it there just because it's a bare bed of rock. But they'll fly there to nest because there's nothing there. Yeah. Nothing can get to them, and only other birds can get there. So,
which is another interesting thing about flying, is that you can put your nest places.
Yes.
That nothing can reach or nothing can get to, which is great for your little baby birds. Unless they fall out, I guess.
Yeah. And so it definitely has complications, which we'll get to. But one of the biggest things that flight does, past all this, is you can just move faster. You can migrate in a matter of days what would take other animals months.
Yeah.
You can cross country, so you can forage across miles within an afternoon. You can disperse your species, so a flying species can spread and diversify very quickly as it crosses a country within just a matter of years. And so flight just, you now are not going around trees, you're just going over it all and landing somewhere else. And it really changes the way that these animals can move around.
We should point out that there is a difference. We're talking about specifically powered flight.
Yes.
Which is distinct from a lot of animals which glide.
Mm-hmm.
And gliding has a lot of similar benefits. One of the biggest benefits of gliding that I hear come up a lot is that a squirrel, for example, a gliding squirrel, gliding frog, whatever it is, can make it from one tree to the other without having to go all the way down, all the way across, all the way back up.
Yeah, it cuts out the middleman.
Animals that have achieved powered flight can do that almost indefinitely.
Yeah, with
you can
all
go
aspects
from
of life.
mountain to mountain or island to island in ways that nothing else can accomplish.
And so it really, and you'll hear lots of, and the gliding is a good thing to bring up because lots of the animals that glide you'll hear as the flying squirrel. You know,
yeah.
The
Flying fish.
this, the flying that, the flying fish.
Flying snakes.
Yes. Which is Quetzalcoatl, who was a god.
Which was actually indeed a flying snake.
Yes. We cannot deface him for fear of bringing about his wrath. So
don't say his name again. If you say it 3 times, he'll appear as a guest on the podcast.
All right. So
continue.
With how awesome flying is, that really brings up the question, why are we not a world of flying animals?
Yes.
Why would you choose to walk at all? Like, why would any walking animal still be around? And the answer is that flying is super awesome, but it would be the equivalent of using a NASCAR to get to work. It's super complicated and super high cost in being able to do that. Both energy-wise, flying is a very high energy and intake activity. That the reason we eat birds is because they have so much muscle, because they need every little bit of that to get off the ground.
Yeah.
Like, if you ever watch just a slow motion of like a pigeon taking off, it's crazy. They literally are standing there, and then they like jump their body length up into the air, and then immediately start flapping like 5 times within the. It's like 4 or 5 flaps within the first second for them to be able to get. It's crazy.
Because for birds, your legs and arms both need to be powerful enough to not only lift your own weight, but propel your own body weight.
To ignore gravity.
Yep.
And so it's very high cost. It also requires a very specialized body.
Yes.
This is one of the biggest things that if you ever, go to sci-fi or fantasy movies with certain types of biologists, of course, neither of which are on this podcast.
Of course not. Pretentious people, really.
Yes. And you watch something with a big flying monster, that is one of the biggest things people talk about, is that there's no way that could fly. Its wings need to be like 10 times the size. Its body's way too heavy. Flying is a really complicated set of equations on you have to have a certain wingspan. You can only weigh so much, according to how big you are. And you have to then also be aerodynamic. So you can't be a flying brick. You have to be sleek. And that means a very, you have to give up certain things. You have to develop all of that. And then the weight in and of itself is another category of complications where you can't be a heavy hitter and also fly. You have to give up a lot of that toughness, which means injury is now a very real possibility of just if a stork trips, that could be a broken leg. Like,
right.
One little trip and that leg's going to snap like a twig because it's so thin.
And if that stork, quote unquote, trips in flight, it is very, very dangerous to crash.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're running across the plains and you trip, that's dangerous. If you're flying and you make a mistake, this is high risk, high reward sort of lifestyle. And I think one of the best examples to point at the fact that flying is so costly and so difficult is that if you, as we discussed a couple episodes ago, if you give a flying species even a glimmer of a chance, it will lose flight.
Yeah.
Birds have lost flight over and over and over again because if you don't have to do it, it really ends up being beneficial in a lot of cases to give it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that I think is really important to mention, and we'll get into this more, I suppose, when we talk about the evolution of flight.
Absolutely.
But all of those sort of ingredients that you need to achieve flight have to evolve, and evolution doesn't work with a plan in mind, which means all of these ingredients have to come together for various reasons in the right animal, which means evolving a body that is capable of flight requires many, many steps to get there, and the right sort of selective pressure and the right sort of habitat. So not only is it difficult to do, it's just statistically less likely to happen.
Yes. On the note of that statistical small window, only 4 groups of animals have ever developed flight. And with most of them, it seems for the most part, it developed one time and diversified like crazy.
Yes, so 4 times
4 times ever.
in almost 1 billion years of vertebrate life. I'm sorry, of animal life. I'm showing my bias.
Yeah.
Animal life
In almost
has...
1 billion years of important life.
Take that, microbiologists.
They're the ones that can weaponize stuff, so we should we should be nice to them.
Sharks with laser beams, you say? Well, here's a tiny vial.
You just sniff this. What does it smell like to you? Smallpox, you say.
So 4 times.
So 4 times, and each of those have become crazily successful. These 4 groups are birds, bats, pterosaurs, and insects, working backwards from when they developed it.
Yes.
And these all are some of the most successful groups of animals. Even the pterosaurs, which are completely extinct. They went extinct right alongside, a lot of other stuff at the KPG boundary. But during their time, they had a nearly 145 million years of time on the Earth. So they were by no means just like a blip. They were around for a while. They diversified. We talked about in one news article that it got really big, and they had really small ones. So they did a lot. Birds, bats, and insects are 3 of the most successful groups on the planet today.
Yeah. Bats are second most diverse mammals, with somewhere in the vicinity of 1,000 species.
Yep.
Birds are the most diverse terrestrial vertebrates, with somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 species.
Yeah.
And insects make up the majority of life on land. There are like 1 million, and I'm not saying like 1 million as a big number that I'm pulling off the top of my head. There are approximately 1 million living insect species, and almost all of them fly.
When I looked up to try to get just rough numbers, and I'm sure these have changed since the time that this was, I got where I got these estimates from, just because this sort of stuff varies. But it said there's at least 3 million species in the 4 most specious orders of insect, which are all 4 flighted. And the estimates range between just under 3 to just under 8 million species, with an average around 5.5 million. So crazy amounts.
Yeah, something about flight is, it's difficult to do, it's difficult to get there, but once you achieve that, all 4 groups explode into diversity. Because you've opened up an entire new niche. It's very much like when life first moved onto land.
Yeah.
Now there's 1 million new niches for you to explore, and so natural selection is going to experiment like crazy. Same thing happens with flight.
It's like when eyes first developed in early life forms, there was a huge amount of speciation, because now it goes, oh wait, I can see what I'm eating. Now I can chase it.
Do all sorts of stuff.
This got crazy. Now, with each of these, one of the cool things is they each discovered a different way to fly.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are pretty straightforward. We all know that birds use feathers. We mentioned the patagiums, as well as things like having hollow bones and, structures for flying. Similar with all of them is a very keeled chest to hold all of that muscle that is needing for flapping.
Yes.
And so that's with all 3 of the vertebrates, the birds, the bats, and the pterosaurs, all have that very specialized chest. With each one, though, they had slightly different methods. The feathers with the birds, obviously, and then both bats and pterosaurs went with just patagium flight, meaning that they just had those flats of skin. Same thing you think of when you think of a bat wing, dragon wings, all of those classic leathery wings.
Yeah, and all 3 of those vertebrate groups, unlike dragon wings, are just the front arms.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that you've come up with a new limb. You have, and that's another interesting point about the pros and cons of flight, you have to give up a lot of your arm functionality to allow it to become this flying tool.
Yeah. And it's interesting how each one did it, because birds, basically their hand shrunk. It became very reduced. The bones became much more simplified to where it is now just kind of a core for all those feathers to grow off from. Bats, as you can see very clearly, just stretch their hands out. Their fingers got long and skinny. Oh, it's so cool looking. And we'll get into it because they used to be even cooler. But they now have patagiums, same ones. They have the propatagium that goes in front, but then they have what are called dactyl patagiums that are the ones in between each digit.
Cool.
And then the palgeopatagium, which is from the last digit to the back legs. And then the uropatagium that goes between the legs and the tail. So they're much more like a glove, like a kite, where it is going all the way around. And the cool thing about that is they are much slower than birds, but much more accurate. Like, if you watch bats fly, they can make very tight turns. They're much more like a helicopter, even though they can't hover. But they are flying very slow, but can turn on a dime and catch and eat on the wing. You know, so they will catch insects and then consume the insect without ever landing. And so they're very dexterous in the air, which is very cool. Pterosaurs also use these patagiums, and they have many of the similar ones, the pro one, the euro one between the legs. But then they have the brachiopatagium, which is just the bulk of the wing, because their wing, instead of forming between the fingers, they stretched out their one main finger, which is the fourth digit, and that formed the support for the majority of the wing.
Yeah, they essentially, if your pinky just stretched way longer than your body and held up this wing membrane, which is cool because it leaves their hand. They still have a hand on top of that. Yeah.
Instead of just having the one thumb claw,
which was an interesting part of pterosaur lifestyle because unlike birds and bats largely, pterosaurs were quadrupeds.
Yeah.
When pterosaurs landed, they walked on all fours.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a bird cannot do that. A bird's wing does not allow it to do that.
And some bats can, just depending on which bat depends on how well they can.
Yeah.
The closest you get is a vampire bat, which can actually like hop around and stuff because they hunt on the ground.
Yeah, they do. You can find videos of them like hunting,
the vampire stalks its prey,
cows and pigs, and they're just bouncing around on the ground behind them.
It hops behind their ankles and nibbles at their toes.
Yep.
So all of them found different ways and moved in different ways, and the differences also go on and on. Once again, each could have a list and whole episode or podcast done about them on how they were flying. Insects are the weird one because they're the one invertebrate. So their wings are actually extra limbs, and they are four.
We'll take a second here. I just want to repeat that last sentence. Insects evolved extra limbs to fly.
Yeah.
They already had 6. Not enough for them.
Yeah, no, that's 6. Why stop there? Yeah,
Well,
once you get
going.
past 4, I mean, sky's the limit.
Apparently.
So insects have 2 pairs of wings. Now, some fly with the wings connected and some fly with them separate, and this is separated by direct and indirect flight. Direct flight being where the muscles on the inside of the insect's body connect to the wings and flap them directly. This would be like dragonflies, mayflies, and on those the wings are separated, so you get that nice helicopter alternating movement with dragonflies, but they can't fold their wings, so they tend to have that very stuck out from outside of them. The majority of other insects, basically everyone else, have indirect flight, which is even crazier, because instead they have those 4 wings have now connected to form basically 2 wings, or function like a beetle where one wing has become a wing cover, and why not just turn one of your wings into armor, man?
Some insects have also lost some of their wings. Flies are named for that, where their second pair, essentially, or one of the pairs has been reduced to these little nubbins, and they're only using 2.
Equalizers, like those little nubbins act to keep them balanced it's really crazy when you get into how insects fly and the physics. I'm sure you've heard, everyone has heard about how bees shouldn't be able to fly when looked at it from an engineering standpoint, and that there's other insects where there's questions on how exactly are you staying up there.
Some flight expert out there is really angry at you because you said that.
I know,
Because
right?
I've heard people get really... Because apparently that's like...
I've heard that it's not as cut and dry as it's always made out to be.
Yeah.
But I've also heard that there's other insects where we're not sure exactly how they maneuver the way they do. To where it's
Yeah.
like, I don't know how you're managing this. Like those little daily bobs on flies, I'm pretty sure were fairly recent, not like within the last few years, but like last few decades discovery. Like the fact that that was how that's why flies are able to like zoom up and land upside down on your ceiling. Like you're used to it because a fly does that, but that like be a helicopter pilot flipping the helicopter over and landing upside, like it's crazy.
Yeah. We're going to spend most of our time talking probably about the vertebrates.
Yes.
But don't let that fool you into thinking that insects are not by far the most accomplished, diverse, successful, and impressive flyers.
Yeah.
By a huge, huge margin.
Crazy margin. And it makes sense because they did it first, and they've had
Way
the most
first.
time to perfect it.
They accomplished it like 200 million years before anybody else.
Before we move on, just to mention what indirect flight actually is, this is where the muscles inside the insect's body, instead of flapping the wings, just flex the body cavity so that it makes the wings flap.
Yes.
So this is like when you breathe and your chest expands, but if that also made you raise your arms.
The other really ridiculous thing about insect flight is that some insects who flap their wings slowly flap them essentially like birds do, which would essentially be like a person. You flap your arms.
Yeah.
And it's just flap, 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 flap. But with insects, a lot of insects have wing beats that are hundreds of beats per second, and that is too fast for nerves to recharge.
Mm-hmm.
So the insect's not thinking about every flap. Essentially, it's like a breaker switch.
Yeah.
And they turn on flapping, or they turn it off.
Yes.
And it's just these really rapidly moving muscles that all the nerve does is say, start, stop.
Yeah.
And then they tilt the body and they shift the direction of the wings to make to accomplish maneuverability in the air.
It's really crazy.
One of the other interesting differences between them, when we think about birds flying, this is especially an interesting difference between birds and pterosaurs. Birds, all the feathers that they have on their wings gives them a lot of individual control over the wing shape.
Mm-hmm.
So if you ever look at an airplane, and somebody out there, by the way, is being semantic and saying, actually, 5 groups of animals have learned how to fly, could say, yes, we did it too, but we cheated.
No. Machines learned how to fly.
Machines are evolving the ability to fly.
It is just a symbiotic relationship with humans.
But if you watch an airplane, there are moving parts on an airplane's wing that allows it to change the shape. And birds can accomplish this to a degree with their feathers. Pterosaurs and insects, and bats I'm not really sure, but I know pterosaurs and insects, their wings are to a degree constructed so that when they meet air resistance, their shape changes to make them aerodynamic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like if you took a piece of paper and you flapped it through the air, it buckles back and forth as the wind goes over it. Insects and pterosaurs aren't able to actively change the shape of their wings all that much, but just the act of moving through the air helps them to maintain an aerodynamic shape.
It's like flight autocorrect.
Yeah, which is really cool, especially for insects, because they don't have, for the most part, you can't have big muscles running through those wings.
Mm-mm.
So you couldn't really be able to change the shape all that much. You have to have this sort of passive cambering, I believe is what it's called.
Insect wings are basically just the same chitinous material their body's made of. It's a cuticle with veins flowing through it for when they are first, pumping the wings out after hatching or metamorphosizing.
Yeah.
After that, it's basically just this set thing. Some can fold them. Beetles can fold theirs up under their wing case, but they're not going to do that like nice stretching things that birds do. It's either open or closed. We've talked about how they fly. We've talked about how it's different, what's unique. Now, how did each one evolve? And with birds, there's a lot to go over with
Yes.
that one. And we're not going to do it all here because that will definitely be its own episode someday, because bird evolution in general, but definitely flight evolution in bird is a majorly studied, many parts of it are debated, and it is a huge topic to cover. But generally, birds first appear mid-late Jurassic, about 160 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
They derive from the groups of dinosaurs within theropods, those two-legged predatory dinosaurs. First bird was classically, you typically will hear Archaeopteryx, but recent research has put Aornis ziu, or zui. I'm not sure, it's a Chinese species discovered not too long ago, which is now the most basal bird.
Interesting. I know there was also Xiaotingia was discovered not too long ago.
That
which
was
is
also
another
listed.
one.
There's kind of like a little, like 3 or 4 specimen club of the most basal birds that I'm sure will switch places as people discover new things about each one. But very early birds, many of them shared many features with their dinosaur cousins of teeth, longer tails, claws on the wings, stuff like that. The origin of flight is pretty well documented on how they developed wings. The reasoning for why they developed wings is kind of one of the big questions. And in what direction? And by that I mean there's usually 2 main groups of thought. There are others, but it is either the cursorial or arboreal track of evolution, which you'll typically hear as the ground up or tree down.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that I think a lot of people, there's been a lot of discussion in the past of why do they have feathers, why do they have wings, this and that. And the evolution of bird features, hollow bones, long powerful arms, feathers, is actually very well documented.
Yeah.
And each of those features comes about for various different reasons, and we see them being applied to various different uses in extinct organisms. The big question is, once you had those features, right, you have an animal that uses its super powerful arms for snatching at prey, and it uses its feathers for display or for keeping warm or whatever. What was the impetus to then start selecting for aerial maneuverability and aerodynamics, and why did you start to fly?
And the arboreal is probably the most obvious one that comes to mind of these were animals that climbed trees, lived in trees, and then would glide tree to tree or use their wings to help move branch to branch.
Mm-hmm.
And flapping was eventually introduced that helped them glide further and eventually fly altogether.
Yeah, it's a really obvious step from parachuting to gliding to flying.
And so that's definitely one of those possibilities. The cursorial is more the idea that they were using the wings to balance, while they were running, to keep, while running at high speeds, they would basically put those out to help them stabilize. They could also flap while running to either help them climb up trees or run up inclines, things like that, of flapping to help them move forward, and basically moving the opposite direction and eventually flying up the tree instead of running and flapping up the tree.
Yeah. It's one of the most striking images that there's been a lot of studies in this, what's called wing-assisted incline running.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that a lot of birds, especially birds that don't fly very much, and baby birds whose wings aren't developed yet, will run up a steep slope and flap their wings to help them run up there at inclines that other animals might not be able to do without that aerodynamic support.
It's going to be a funny image, and I'm sure someone out there who absolutely loves the idea of a feathered velociraptor is going to groan when I say it. But think of how a chicken moves around.
Yeah.
Like, when you watch a chicken try to get up something, it starts flapping and looks like it's out of control, but gets up there.
Yeah.
That sort of idea.
Now, we should point out that birds are not the only dinosaurs that had wings.
Yes.
wings, and all these, hollow bones, feathers, all the bird type things are actually really widespread across this corner of the dinosaur family tree. We know that there is direct evidence that some dinosaurs used their long feathery arms to cover their eggs. It is almost certain that some of them were using the long wing feathers for display.
Yeah.
It's been suggested, like Will was saying, that they're using them to help maneuver or to help balance. Like, they had evolved wings before wings were actually really common. And so this probably only once, maybe a couple times, that's a little bit ambiguous, did they sort of get co-opted for aerodynamics. There is at least one example of gliding in, well, two, I guess, of gliding in non-bird dinosaurs. What's always really interesting to me about the trees down, ground up discussion is that trees down sounds so obvious that ground up sounds stupid.
Yes.
At first glance, but the whole reason that ground up gained a lot of popularity is because there is really very little evidence for arboreal, which is to say tree-dwelling, dinosaurs.
Yeah, dinosaurs started on the ground, so...
If birds were gliders out of trees before they started flying, we have not seen any really solid evidence of it in the fossil record.
Yeah. So it's one of those cool things where just because an answer seems obvious doesn't mean it's right. It's one of the few times where Occam's razor will betray you.
Yeah.
So that is as much as we're really going to hit on with birds, because once again we could go in and into it on how did all the features develop.
One more thing, actually, real quick about birds, and I want to mention this because it separates them from the other animals. We mentioned before that birds have those really powerful legs for jumping into the air. That's something they have because they inherited it from a long, long legacy of ground-running animals.
Awesome ground predators.
Which is another really big support for this notion that they started on the ground and took off from there. That they had these crazy beefy legs for jumping, possibly for climbing, definitely for running, that really are something very unique to that line of reptilian life.
Yeah. Once again, this is why the drumstick is such a popular piece of the bird. It's because there's a lot of muscle there.
Yeah. So the evolution of like their ancestors and their close cousins is actually really well understood. But that short time span in which they transitioned from the ground to the air is really difficult to narrow to sort of pin down, because like we discussed before, and there was actually a study that came out just a couple of years ago that showed that the evolution of the different bird traits was slow and gradual until they all came together and they started flying, at which point birds erupted in diversity.
Yeah.
So when you start flying, you explode in diversity, and that is a lot of evolution in a very short amount of time, which doesn't leave a lot in the fossil record for us to kind of narrow down, which is why the other three groups are crammed into what's left of this podcast episode.
Yes. And there's the other reason for the other three being seemingly left till the end is they are in a very, very opposite situation of birds. Whereas in birds, we have an actually really good view of how birds developed from dinosaurs. There's of course gaps, and there's definitely issues with some not fossilizing well, because once again, as we mentioned earlier, when you're a flyer, you're delicate. So you don't always preserve well. But we have a decent record when it comes to birds. With bats, pterosaurs, and insects, we do not just have a poor record, we don't have a record of how they develop flight.
No, we don't.
We have the earliest fossils of each of those being a fully flighted individual, and then before that, there not being anything that looks like them. And so we don't even know which group of mammals bats really definitely came from.
No, we don't. Because we mentioned this in the snake episode. Flying animals are so weird, they've changed so much that it's really difficult to identify, to compare them to other groups of life and identify exactly where their relations lie.
Pterosaurs have the same issues. And so all three of these groups we really have no good clues as to how they develop flight. Now, we can draw some conclusions
Mm-hmm.
from looking at how they are flying and kind of work backwards into seeing maybe how that would have developed, but we don't have any transition specimens, in transitional species of a gliding bat or a,
Yeah.
you know, tree climbing pterosaur. We got a early pterosaur, an early bat, and an early flying insect.
Yep.
And that's it. So on these, there's still interesting stuff. The early specimens are still cool.
Oh yeah.
Once again, though, especially with bats and pterosaurs, fossil record for them is really, really rough because these were basically animals made out of a series of twigs being held together. Like,
Made out of twigs that are actually just rolled up pieces of paper.
yes, like crazy delicate. These animals. If you ever get a chance to look at a bat skeleton and look at the ulna of a bat arm,
Yeah.
it's like a
It's a
toothpick.
toothpick. It is a toothpick. That's all it is.
It's crazy. So these, when they fossilize, don't usually fossilize well, and then past that, don't fossilize very often.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as bats, they show up early Eocene, about 52 million years ago. The earliest one is fully flighted, and it looks unfortunately in the fact that it doesn't give us much answers past it, looks very similar to the modern microbats, which are the little
Yeah.
ones that fly around catching bugs. There's the microbats and the large fruit-eating bats are the two main groups of modern bats. It looks basically like a little bat. There's not much sticking out. There's a few differences. And so the two big ones is, as far as they can tell, with this is, let's see if I can pronounce this one right. It's a fossil from Wyoming, and it's Onychoncertus finii.
Onychonicterus.
Onychonicterus. That sounds a lot better. I like that one better. We'll go with that one.
Like I said, my scientist superpower.
Yep. Onychonicterus
Taxonomic names.
was a species.
You know, it's funny because I've thought about it in the past of like if we get scientific names wrong to just edit it out.
Yeah.
But I get the feeling that it must be so refreshing and encouraging for people to hear us get them wrong,
Oh, absolutely.
even though we
Absolutely.
made a career out of it.
Oh, yeah. It's by no means, no one be mistaken. Latin words are hard, no matter what.
They're hard because no one speaks that language.
There's a
and we're
reason it's
making
dead.
it up. Yeah.
So this was a specimen about 52 million years ago. It's one of the oldest, and it is a fairly well preserved specimen. And one of the big debates with bat evolution was, did echolocation or flight evolve first? Because with many, especially the microbats, many flying bats, echolocation is a key part of how they maneuver while flying.
Yeah.
That's how they map their environment as they move through it, especially for all those that live in caves. Because how else are you going to navigate a environment of perpetual darkness?
Yep.
You have sound and like psychic abilities, and that second one doesn't exist in real world. So
Yeah.
we
Bats
can't. We have to
evolved
go with sound.
echolocation and ESP.
Yes.
Fun fact. True facts about bats.
That'll be our next episode: is psychic creatures and why I didn't know they exist.
It's gonna be a short episode.
They wipe your memory every time you see them. It's really inconvenient to study them.
Now you sound like a Bigfoot person.
I know, right? We're going to go squatching. It's going to be great. I'm going to use all the terminology.
Bat squatch.
So, that's been one of the big debates, is which came first, which kind of pushed which to develop. Did they gain echolocation and flight come after, or did they start flying and then echolocation was a obvious answer to how to fly in caves?
Mm-hmm.
This one has very well formed wings, and from what they can see with the skull, no signs of echolocation. The inner ear and everything doesn't have any of those features, so most likely early bats were not echolocating, which modern fruit bats do not. So this is not a crazy concept, but they started flying first, according to this.
And it's worth pointing out that birds don't echolocate either.
Yes, except for the ones that click. I can't remember those. There was one cave dwelling birds.
Yeah. But you hear people when they talk about flight a lot. This comes up especially in sort of general conversation. This notion that bats don't have feathers, but they manage it.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a bunch of different ways to approach this problem and to succeed at it.
Yes. Now, coolest thing about this early bat and many others is that it was a little bit different, and this gives us some clues as to how they might have developed flight. First off, it has shorter arms, longer legs, and the coolest part, all 5 digits of the wings still had claws.
Ooh.
Which is visually fantastic.
Terrifying.
But with that setup, this leans toward a image of a creature that was climbing with longer back legs and still able to grip with the wings, and then gliding, or at least flying from those higher places, which supports to use our previous terminology, a tree down form of evolution with the bats, where they are starting by either climbing up the trees and then gliding around and making a mixture of climbing and gliding, or limited flapping to move around, and then eventually developing full flight.
Yeah, it's interesting because the same sort of patagia that you see in these flying animals also evolved in animals that parachute just to slow their fall, or things like gliding squirrels.
Yeah.
And that sort of step-by-step is easy to see as a trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
It's also supported by the fact, like you said, we don't really know where bats fall in the mammal family tree.
Yes.
But a lot of the time, studies put them nearby things like rodents or primates, which is another bit of support for this idea that they may have descended from tree-climbing ancestry.
Yes.
Which really... And there are plenty of gliders across the mammal family tree.
Absolutely. And some really, really cool ones. Like, there are some gliders that have specialized in just gliding. Like, they haven't developed a form of flapping, but there are supreme gliders. So it's very likely one of those just took it that step further.
Yeah. And that's another real quick point, because this is a whole other episode, I'm sure. Yeah. Gliding isn't necessarily a step toward flying.
Yes.
There are tons of animals that are gliders that do just fine without having to give up all of that stuff we talked about before and make a transition into flying. Most gliding animals probably never go, anything beyond gliding, because gliding is all that they need.
If you can be a squirrel that just has a lot of extra skin, that's a very little cost for a whole new way of getting around.
Yeah.
So that's generally with bats. Like I said, these last few are going to be brief because
real quick.
I'm giving you almost everything. With birds, we gave you the very briefest glimpse because there's too much. Here, I'm giving you most of what I could find without getting into the really nitty-gritty details of...
We could always do an entire episode.
Oh, yeah.
Devoted to each of these groups, and we probably will at some point.
Yeah. Because bat evolution is still fascinating on when did they develop echolocation, and how did it change, how did bats change as they went along? Just because we don't know how they started flying doesn't mean that they didn't do cool stuff later.
Yeah.
On to pterosaurs, which show up toward late Triassic and stick around to the end of the Cretaceous, so about 228 million years to 66 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The earliest fossils, once again, are fully flighted, and these are, once again, very delicate. And if I'm remembering right, most fossils are found, shoreline fossil deposits, and aquatic where they fell into water and were able to be preserved.
Yeah, that's very common for pterosaurs.
One of the big reasons why bats and pterosaurs, but especially bats, don't fossilize well is they're terrestrial. So they weren't often falling in places where they were going to fossilize well. They were usually falling on the forest floor where things eat you when you die.
So there's a lot going against fossilizing these animals. And then, like we mentioned in our mini episode, that notion that the earlier you are in the history of a group, the fewer individuals there were to begin with.
Yes.
So trying to find the earliest representatives, there's a whole list of things working against the discovery of these earliest members.
Now, much like with the bats, it's not quite known where pterosaurs fit in. They're either evolved from basal archosauromorphs, or basal
Ornithodires.
the ornithodiers, and the which the other name that's also given to that at times is the Ava metatarsali.
Yeah. Dinosaurs plus pterosaurs.
Yes. So they were either right there alongside dinosaurs or slightly off somewhere else. It's hard to know when you don't have the thing they started from. Now, one of the cool things is some of the evidence, if they did evolve alongside that or close to that group of dinosaurs, is that early members of that dinosaur group and the ancestors to that dinosaur group were, little bipedal terrestrial animals.
Yeah.
And one of the big debates for a long time with pterosaurs in general was how they moved around. Now, we mentioned earlier that now we have good evidence for the fact that they walked on all fours. And were fairly capable at it. Earlier back, I had kids' books from when I was younger where they were still debating, did they walk on all fours or walk on two legs and just tuck their wings up?
Yeah.
So that was a question that we still didn't quite know until recently. But then on top of that question, we don't know whether they evolved bipedally or quadrupedally.
Yeah.
And so that's been a big debate. If they evolved, though, from those ornithodiers, or basal ancestors of the ornithodiers, it most likely is that they were bipedal and moved to a quadrupedal stance, since those ancestors were mostly bipedal.
Yeah, and if they evolved from those bipedal running ancestors, they may have had a similar ground-up trajectory as birds may have had, as we discussed.
Now, that, and once again, there's lots of more details, but that's about as much as I have for like the basic overviews. If we get into much more when it comes to pterosaurs, you start getting into the really, really nitty-gritty of studying the cool details, but very technical ones. Pterosaurs are very mysterious.
Yeah.
Which is cool. They're very cool animals, but they kind of pop up.
Yeah, they do fantastically, though, for a long time. One really interesting thing that I always like to bring up with pterosaurs in terms of comparing the evolution of one group to the other, I mentioned before that birds have those big beefy back legs that they use. Flying animals don't fly themselves into the air.
Yes.
They jump and then flap. Birds can do that with their back legs because they've got those big beefy theropod legs. Pterosaurs can't do that. Pterosaur hind legs are not very big and strong.
Kind of puny.
Which has led to this really fascinating interpretation of how pterosaurs took off. For a long time, there was this suggestion that they had to jump off of cliffs in order to catch air.
That they were only cliff-dwelling species that either used updrafts or dove to get that speed and power to fly.
And you see that a lot with bats, where bats tend to hang out in high places and then take
drop
off
like
from
bombardiers.
there. Yep. But there has been some modeling that has shown that pterosaurs were most likely capable of taking off with their arms.
Doing super push-ups.
Super push-ups, where they just do a big heave and throw themselves into the air with their arms instead of with their legs. We'll put this in the blog post, because I have one of the videos of this model. One of the most fascinating points that this brings up is that this is really intuitive because it means that all the muscle that you need in this animal is in the arms.
Yeah.
The same muscles that you're using to fly are also the launching muscles. Whereas birds have all this extra weight in the back, which could potentially, this is a whole other discussion, but I've heard it suggested that that might be one of the reasons why pterosaurs were able to get so much bigger than birds have been.
It was all centralized.
Yep. No matter how powerful a bird's wings are, they also have to carry its giant legs. Whereas with a pterosaur, and there were some bats like the vampire bats that we mentioned before, also take off this way, where they push off.
Massive push with the front limbs and a little bit of aid of the back.
Yep. So really cool, different body plan that makes for a very different method of flying.
And it makes sense when your wing design, with a bird is you've basically reduced your front limbs and added features onto them. a pterosaur's front limbs have to be, due to design, the same length as their wingspan. So when you have big pterosaurs, your limb has to be 6 feet long.
Yeah.
Down to the tip. So you can't help but focus energy on those long limbs, because if you then put anything on the back feet, you're going to have this thing that has 6-foot front arms, 3-foot back legs, and just this giant, spindly, crazy thing that's having to launch itself up into the air.
Yeah.
They're really cool animals. You get some really crazy, pterosaurs get really crazy with the head crests.
There's a pterosaur episode in the future.
Oh, yeah. So they do cool stuff. Insects being our final and the first to fly. Once again, same category in that they do not really have an answer, but they actually have a few more hypotheses hinging on the verge of theory as to what the possible origins could have been by looking at earlier insects and the features they had, because now at least you're dealing with, an invertebrate group, Insectia, which is a very broad group, but you can still at least look at features across them and see that they're body plans. Now, insects first learned to fly about 350 million years ago is when the first winged insect was found, and if you look up a picture, it just looks like a really big cockroach. Like it's pretty much just a flying insect.
Yeah, there are a handful, much like the other groups, there's a handful of insects that were already flying. Like, there was already a little bit of a diversity of insects by the Carboniferous. So, and this is a really interesting note, that insects seem to have taken to the air around the same time that vertebrates took to the land. They were way ahead of us.
They're like, "Aw, that's cute."
Look at them crawling out of the water.
You're learning to walk? All right, well, I'm going to be up here.
I like to imagine that there must be a story somewhere of the first fish who just generations and generations spent, one of these days I'm going to get up on land and eat that bug. We've been watching these bugs. All we have to do is evolve the right features. We're going to get up there. And they finally make it. He
finally gets out. He's like, "Come here, you son of a..."
And it's gone. No!
But I had legs now. It's not fair. I had legs now.
Oh, man. I laughed so hard at that. I don't know if it'll be picked up.
So that's just confirmation that I am super duper funny.
You are very funny.
All right. So, insect flight hypotheses. There are 3 main ideas as to how they came about. 3 main schools of thought or possibilities. There's the paranodal hypothesis, the epicoxal hypothesis, and the indite or excite hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
And they each deal with a different body part, basically, as to what might have been the origin. So, unlike with the others where we're trying to decide what drove you to getting into the air, with insects we're going, all right, which part of you became the wings? Was it a leg, a gill, or some flaps on your back?
Yeah.
Because it's one of those as far as we can tell.
Because the others, it's just what made you start flapping your arms.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
Where did those come from?
Yeah, what are those? Where did you get them?
Where did you get that?
Why? So the paranodal is the idea, many insects today, and some fossil ones, have these kind of lobes on their thorax and some on their abdomen, and it's just these kind of flaps, these flat lobes that might have in past insects, but in some modern ones are used as parachutes. While they fall off of branches or stuff, they'll use those to kind of right themselves so that they land feet down and can start scurrying.
Classic trees down.
Exactly. It's that.
Or I guess in the case of insects, it could be grass down because, you're super tiny.
Absolutely. Except grass wouldn't have been around yet by then, so fern down.
This is a good point.
Fern down.
Or other animal down. These were insects that were jumping off of tetrapods.
So these little flaps Now, the issue with this one, the biggest issue here, is it's very easy to think, all right, you're parachuting, eventually you're gliding, eventually you're flapping.
Mm-hmm.
But with this one, the main issue is that if these were just flaps on the body, at some point they had to develop musculature to make them
Yeah.
flap, which is one of the issues there. The next one answers part of that. So many insects today, the larval states of things like mayflies and the nymphs of certain insects have external gills.
Mm-hmm.
And on some of them they are movable. They are actually musculature. They can move those and articulate them. And the idea is that these may have started as either paddles or sails or something of the sort for while moving
Yeah.
in water to maneuver with these large external gills that then eventually turned into flapping above the surface.
Yeah. Real quick, I should point out that when you say sailing with their gills, that's another one of those things that sounds completely stupid to
Yeah.
suggest. But there are insects that do that.
Yeah, basically, if there's an idea that sounds crazy and out there, some insect is probably doing it.
Oh, yeah. Basically, for the future of this podcast, anytime we say, what a cool evolutionary innovation this was, assume an insect did it first.
And there's some insect sitting on its couch, listening to this going, what the F, guys?
Come on.
This is some BS.
You didn't even mention me.
He just couldn't get that patent signed.
You shouldn't have been microscopic.
We keep editing all of the insects designs. Now the last one is probably the most complex and has the most, as far as I was able to find, the most support or direct support for it. And it's the indite and excite hypothesis. Now, indites and excites are basically leg segments or leg-like structures on the inside and outside of the body. Indites being inside, excites being outside, and they're kind of just these just lateral limb segment things. I'm not sure what their function was supposed to be or is in any modern insects, but they're a fairly common thing. The idea here is that those eventually developed and fused to form the wings. The nice thing about this is it answers why they would have had musculature, because they were already limb-like structures.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest reason that this is a strong hypothesis is that in studying fruit flies, which are one of the most common case study animals for any genetic study, because they're one of the first ones we sequence the genome of, and they are very simple to manipulate and study. I believe they were the ones that the Hox genes were discovered in, and
yeah, I think so.
All that good stuff.
It's genetic and developmental studies go real well when your species has a generation time of a number of days.
Exactly. So you can really watch things change.
Yeah.
In studying fruit flies, a mutation was observed that transformed the costal or leading edge region of the wing into a three-jointed, non-functioning, it didn't have the foot tip, but a three-jointed limb. And the rest of the wing was basically just left there, kind of shriveled.
Interesting.
And so, if that is what happened, a number of these, indites and excites fused to create the wing. And so far, we've seen at least some evidence of it in the reverse.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Insects are an interesting one because the pressures that are required to get you into the sky seem much different for insects. It's much more easy. It's much easier to imagine insects ending up in situations where they would be moving through the air, falling out of trees or whatever. Because if you're an insect, if you're a vertebrate, you can't just jump out of a tree and expect to survive.
Yeah.
But you can if you're an insect.
Yeah, there's tons of insects that is their defense. If something scares me, I just let go of whatever I'm on, and I will fall to the ground faster than it can chase me, and then I run away.
Yeah. So this notion of co-opting some things you already had seems much more intuitive for tiny, tiny animals like insects than it does for the other animals. and it's easier to move your body weight. Like it's a very different world.
It really is. And on that note of it being very different, we can kind of use this to begin to wrap up. Insects kind of stand aside from the other three flyers for another reason. Now, while with birds being the only archosaur group to have developed flight, and bats being the only mammalian group to develop flight, there are very few groups of insects that don't fly.
Yes.
Most groups of insects either had flight and lost it or fly today. And it is now the common. So insects, as we were talking about earlier, saw flight and asked the question of, so why don't we all just fly? And then just did it.
Yeah. And that's absolutely, there are flightless insects that have lost flight for the same reasons as birds have.
Yeah.
But no, it's non-flying insects are few and far between. And the first few that come to mind start off not flying.
Yes.
Like caterpillars just haven't gotten there yet.
Yes, exactly. Like there's very few groups that in their lineage never developed flight.
Yeah.
There's only a few, and everyone else has it or had it and gave it up. So they are and that's, once again, insects are by far one of the most, if not the most successful of all animal groups.
Oh yeah.
And it's almost indefinitely part to the fact that they can all fly. That's the reason why so few other animals than insects can swarm.
Yeah.
Like the ability to move in a mass, in a coordination through 3 degrees of movement is impressive.
Yes, it is.
Well, that is basically all we have to talk about for this episode. We don't have a nice conclusion subject because this one was really covering a whole bunch of potential subjects.
Yeah. It's hard to talk about the subject of flight without getting into, here's 7 more avenues that you wish we had time to talk more about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this one is such a diverse thing. There's a reason why there can be standalone aerospace museums. Is the ability of being able to get up in the air is a fascinating and awe-inspiring thing to do. And the fact that 4 different groups of animals did it and all did it slightly differently is really, really interesting.
Yeah. So if you're listening and you want to hear more about one of these particular groups or one of these particular topics, let us know.
Yeah.
We, ever since the last, especially over the last few episodes, we've gotten a lot more interaction. People have been tweeting at us, commenting, sending us messages. We've gotten a handful of requests, which is really cool. So expect to see some requests coming up soon.
Absolutely.
This is a general reminder that, we can look at download numbers and we can look at likes and stuff, but, the interaction with the fans is really the best metric that we have to tell us what you guys are liking.
Talk to us. So, we're here for you.
Yes, we are. Send us questions, send us requests, leave us reviews, tell your friends about us, whatever you want to do. And we will be back next time for our next episode.
Absolutely. Thanks again for listening, everyone. See ya.
Fly away.
Fly, fly, little bird. Fly, fly.
Fly, fly. Creepy. Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. For more from us, you can follow us on the Common Descent Podcast Twitter account, Facebook page, or on our WordPress blog where we post additional cool stuff for each episode. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome. You can find this and other video game remix music at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope to see you next time.